So I don't know how many of you know who we are, or whether the last one that's Amy and I think Alex gave, but so I'll just do a little bit. So that's where we are in Southwest London, covering mainly Merton and Wandsworth, but we have done projects in Islington, and we're trying to talk to people in various other boroughs like Richmond and Kingston and Camden at the moment as well. So we're slowly sort of spreading out across London, and we'd love to be doing stuff in Tower Hamlets because they got really aggressive targets of 2025 for zero carbon. So we really would like to be doing some stuff with them too. So there's two parts to what we do really. There is the bit we're going to talk about today, which is all things renewable energy, renewable heat and energy efficiency. And then there is our outreach, which is things like energy cafes, or currently, because of COVID, an energy helpline. So that's helping with people with fuel poverty. And then we also have outreach programs, so things like eco action games. We've played that at schools, youth centres, libraries, and we get children engaged in playing giant snakes and ladders and higher and lower, but all with a sort of climate action bias to it. So children are learning about this stuff through play, which is really good fun, and adults too. Just before lockdown, I think Richmond Council expressed an interest in running some of those eco action games events for their staff to get them thinking about the next sort of 10 years for them really. And then another bit that we do we started doing now is watch party. So we host our first watch party of the movie 2040. When was that? Maybe early January, and that was part of our first community share offer. So we've just raised £50,000 for putting heat pumps on the Vass Youth Club up in Battersea on Lavender Hill, and we're going to host another one of those on the 12th of March. So we will get that over to Amy, and I'm sure she'll be sending anything out. So if anyone would like to join, I think we're watching the movie Kiss the Ground, which is all about soil and the importance of soil. So if you haven't seen it and you'd like to come along, I think we're going to probably show a shortened version because we might have a lot of children on. So it'll be a 45-minute version. There is a longer version on Netflix. And then there'll be discussions afterwards, which will be really good fun. So if you're around, I think it's 4 p.m. on March 12th. Our first show, I'm sure I deleted that, but somehow I saved it back in, so apologies for that. So if we have a look at a typical house, what are we dealing with here? So space heating is probably the biggest thing. So this is based on the gas boiler, and you'll be producing around 2.5 tons of carbon from that, just under a ton of carbon from hot water. Electricity, again, just under a ton. The good thing about electricity, it's constantly coming down. As more and more renewables get on the grid, we keep seeing that. So I think in previous estimates, maybe about a year, 18 months ago, the BRE was using something like 0.056 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour, and that's now down to I think 0.22. So that's partly reflective of how far behind BRE were, but it also shows the general trend. And I think sort of by 2040 we're down to around about 100 grams. So hence the desire to move to electrical heating, because we know it's going to be cleaner. Even one-to-one electrical heating will be cleaner than using gas boilers. So that's where we are, and a typical household. And this will be based on a 3-bedroom house really, and these are pretty much the kind of numbers that Ofgem talk about, sort of 15,000 kilowatt hours of heating demand and 3,500 of electricity demand, and that's quite a lot of trees, 185 trees a year. So people always talk about fabric first, and it's difficult fabric because, as we can see, it's incredibly expensive. So a detached house might cost you £15,000 to £20,000 to install exterior wall insulation. So there's different types of installations. You can have putting a render on the outside of your building, and having insulation built into that render. You may be lucky enough to have a cavity. That's much cheaper. You fill that cavity, and they fill that with foam or beading, and that can cost anywhere between £750 and say £1,500, depending on the size of your house and how many walls you have to fill. And a lot of buildings that may be from the 60s through to the 70s, early 80s would have been unfilled cavities, and then cavities started to get filled from the 80s onwards. So if you got a house in that period, then you may be, have the option of having cavity wall. The other thing, if you live in a flat, is interior wall insulation, and the issue typically with that is if you're trying to put insulation on, you might lose sort of 8 centimeters off of your room. You have to extend window frames and those kind of things. So it's typically quite invasive. And another risk of interior wall insulation that you often see in flats is something called cold bridging. So if you've got a really, really warm wall, great, and you've done all your walls, and say the flat above you have done all theirs. However, if you've got a huge, great lintel across there that isn't insulated between the two floors, then you can sometimes get a cold bridge, and where you got cold and you got hot, you get mold. So if you ever see mold in flats, it's typically because of that issue of cold bridging. So they're things to be aware of when you're looking at those kind of solutions. There are new technologies coming onto the market, sort of spray-on resins. We've worked with something called Eco Resin 1 before, and it's a clear resin, 0.5 millimeter is around about the equivalent of 50, 60, 70 mil of mineral wool. So very interesting product, but it still needs to go through the BBA and the BRE. So we've only run sort of initial trials on that, and we've done one house down in Tooting actually. So if anyone's going to see what it looks like, it's pretty good, because the house next door is painted exactly the same color, so you can kind of see the impact of it really. Loft insulation is the most obvious and the cheapest thing to do. So the current recommendation, I think, is 275 mil. So if you're not at that, then if you were having an EPC, they would typically recommend 275 mil as the optimal. And 10 years ago, that number was probably 200. So we're constantly increasing that figure. Doors and windows are really important. As you can see, 25% of heat loss through there. So if you've got secondary or double glazing or triple glazing, really makes a huge impact, and a well-fitting door. But again, these things are very costly. A door will cost you £1,500 for a new well-fitted door. And then ground insulation, it really depends on what you've got. So it's suspended floors, timber floors, solid floors. There are, for instance, with solid floors, there are sort of screes that you can put in now. So the spray on resin I was talking about, they also have a scree version of that you can actually go over your, say, concrete floors, and that will insulate in a very small extra, maybe 0.5 millimeter layer, and have the same impact as, say, with a suspended floor where you're spraying foam or something underneath it. Will have pretty much the same impact. So there's some clever technologies out there. We don't really get involved in insulation at the moment, just because we've been focused on the more the easier technologies to get involved with, really. The first of those really being, I'll start here actually. I just realized I've not been in presentation mode. Apologies. This might be easier for everybody to see. Let me just jump through. Right, we'll start with a smaller thing. So, I mean, something that we can all do is LED lighting, and it's really easy, and it's really good payback. So, if you think about a standard screw-in bulb like the picture we've got there, that might be 50 watts for a traditional bulb. You'll be taking that down to about 6 watts for an LED bulb. So you can kind of work out the maths yourself. You might have that light on 2-4 hours a day. Okay, how many days a year? Work out all those numbers, and then you kind of say, okay, well, this bulb's going to cost me £2, £4, whatever it might be, but I'm actually going to save £5 a year, so it pays back within the first year. Things like recessed lighting, you typically will have to have an electrician in, because transformers will need to be changed. Because you've got much lower power need, you need a lower transformer. So we've just had some done here, and I think it kind of worked out installed around about £25-30 per fitting. So you can kind of work your numbers out from that, really, on what impact that will have. And it really depends on how often you use your lights. If we look at some other commercial projects, the first project we ever did was at the Doddington Rollo Community Association. And because that was an underground car park before, it's incredibly dark. So lots of units have no natural daylight. So we worked on 40 hours a day working week for them, but the corridor's 24 hours. And because the corridors were on 24 hours, that means it kind of paid back in well, just so rapidly that they pay their loan. Some money goes to us for community fund for fuel poverty work up in that area, and yet they're still saving £500 a month. So they got an interest-free loan. They pay back, say, £3,000 a year, but they still save an additional £6,000 a year. So their overall savings are £9,000 on a £22,000 investment. So LEDs are a really, really simple way to get involved in this process and your sort of step to sustainability, really. I think I've covered everything. The other thing to think about, is they last a whole lot longer. So if you've got a normal bulb, it's typically rated to last around about 1,000 hours. Strip lighting or the halogen spotlights you have, the recessed lighting you might have, they'll last around about 5,000 hours. LEDs typically are 30,000. Some of the more expensive ones are 50,000 hours. So you've also got that you're not replacing them so often. So if it's something like recessed lighting, which is a real pain to get up to, and sometimes transformers blow as well, there's a huge element of your maintenance costs going down, as well as your day-to-day savings on just running your energy bills, really. The other two areas are relatively low cost and easy to get installed are smart thermostats and smart TRVs. Smart thermostat, a lot of it is just about being able to control your house remotely. So you can say to the thermostat, oh, I'm going to be 2 hours late, don't turn my heating on yet. Hence the reason the savings are around about 10%. It does also learn the fabric of your building and how long it takes to heat a room or the whole building to that temperature. And it knows the outside temperatures. So on a colder day, it will know it will need to start earlier. On a warmer day, it know it will need to start later. So it saves you money that way as well. So there's two areas it saves. So they're kind of good. The next kind of step up from that would be having smart TRVs. And there's lots of different varieties of this. One of the ones I kind of think is kind of interesting is Radbot. So these things, they're programmable. You can control them typically by your phone, and then you can zone your house. So, for many of us, we're heating the whole house. The heating comes on at 6 o'clock at night. Why are we heating the bedrooms? We're not going to be in our bedrooms till 10 o'clock at night. So you can time things, you can set temperatures. So the typical BRE or RDSAP analysis assumes that living areas like kitchens and lounges should be at 21 degrees. Hallways should be at 19, bedrooms at 18, bathrooms at 22, I think. So you have the ability to kind of zone that at those different temperatures, which is much harder with a traditional 1 to 6 TRV. You can actually get the temperature exactly what you need it to be. You can then also program them, in terms of the timing they come on and all those kind of things. And you can sometimes combine the smart thermostat with the smart TRVs, so you've got a whole house interactive system. The one I was talking about, Radbot, has a couple of interesting features. One, you can set it with a microwave sensor. And what microwave sensors do is they sense body heat. If they're not feeling any body heat in the room, they'll turn down to the normal minimum, which might be, say, 18 degrees or 16 degrees. As soon as someone walks into that room, the heat will come back up. The other thing they have is a boost button. So, one of the issues with the 1 to 6 is, like last month, it got really, really cold. Everyone ramps up their radiator to 6 degrees, to 6. So it's probably coming out, say, 23 degrees in that room. Then leaves it, and then like 2 weeks later, we get a lovely warm daylight today, and my goodness, it's hot in here. And then you turn it back down to 2. With the boost button, you can just hit 1 hour of extra top heat, and then it goes back to its standard setting of, say, 3. So they're kind of interesting. There's lots of different technologies that you can look online. Really good source, Carbon Trust. Green Age website is really good at looking at those kind of things. And obviously, if you've got a Witch subscription, I'm sure they have a lot of detail on this stuff as well. So to the bigger technologies, the one that probably most of you will understand well and know is solar PV. And solar PV is really built on now how much of you can consume in your home. So historically, when we had a feed-in subsidy, it didn't really matter. You put the biggest system you could, because you would get around about a 10% return on investment just from the feed-in tariff. It didn't matter what happened in your home. Now it's really got to be about on-site consumption. So systems probably want to be a bit smaller, like 2.5 kilowatts, maybe a bit too large. Maybe a 2 kilowatt system is ideal, but you're also marrying up the economics of installing a system against that payback. So if you're paying for scaffolding, you may as well have 2.5 kilowatts rather than 2 kilowatts. But we can help you with that. If you're ever interested, we can help you with sort of building some of the models to look at these kind of things so you can understand. So that's the first consideration. I mean, in terms of what's allowed, what's not allowed, this is permitted development unless you're in a conservation area. If you're in a conservation area, it has to be on your back roof, not on the roof facing the road. If you're in a listed building, then you need separate planning permission for that to happen. Though increasingly, and I had a chat with Wandsworth planners yesterday about some of these issues, they're trying to be more accommodating on this stuff. So say on a listed building, if it was on the back of the building, couldn't be seen from the main road, they're probably more likely to say yes now, whereas say 2 years ago, they would just said, no, it's a listed building. Other things to consider when you're looking at a PV system is, you can see on that image, hopefully, black panels. You can have that sort of blue-black, they're a bit cheaper, but it's not a lot of money difference. You can have inlaid, so you can have your roof taken off and have these panels laid into the tiling, which looks amazing, but obviously is much more expensive. The system we're talking about, sort of typical panels like this, but be they blue, black or black, will cost somewhere between 3,500 and 5,000. The other thing that, if you're checking this out, to consider is the outside of the frame. So the default is aluminium, but you can have them in black, which clearly looks a whole lot smarter, as you can see from that image, than having silver bits around the outside of each panel. Orientation is really important. You want to be south facing if you can. So here in London, and this part of London, if you're perfectly south facing with no shading, you might get, say, 925 hours. If you're east or west, you might only get 800 hours. And then shading will have an impact. You can address shading by having what they call optimized panels. So normally you have an inverter that takes the current from the roof, from DC to AC into your house, and you have that inverter sitting off the string of panels. Increasing now, we're seeing optimized systems where there's a small inverter behind each panel. Therefore, if one is shaded, it doesn't impact the rest of the panels and drag down the performance. And they're increasingly, they don't cost that much more. You do get a better return in terms of the number of hours you get. The inverters are warranty for 20-25 years, whereas a typical string inverter is only warranty for, say, 10 years, likely to last 10 to 15 years. So, you've kind of got a whole solution for the next 20-25 years if you go for the microinverter solutions. Payback wise, it really depends on what you're paying and energy inflation. That 10 to 12 years, I think, is probably based off around about 4 or 5% inflation. The reality is we have been seeing around about 7.5% inflation over the last 15 years, compared with CPI inflation of 2.5%. So part of what you're doing here when you put PV on your roof is, one, hopefully providing yourself with electricity at a cheaper rate than the grid, but also getting out of that energy inflation spiral. So as we've seen last year, prices, I think SSE increased their prices 12%. This year it looks like, was it Scottish announced recently, or was it SSE again, 9% increases. And with the minimum standard tariff rate going up, that's kind of going to impact further. So with this system, the more that you can use the electricity yourself, the better your fuel be, and then over time. So if you think about, I only know this off of 12p because I generally give this number for commercials, but at 12p, over 20 years at 2.5%, which is normal inflation, that would be 29p in year 20. At 7.5%, that would be 51p. So you can really see, and you're not charging yourself inflation at all potentially on this to look at your return on investment. So you can see how you're decoupling from energy inflation by putting PV on your roof. The other things to think about with PV is, how can you use the electricity? Battery storage isn't quite there yet. It's still quite expensive. A 5 kilowatt battery will probably cost about 3,000. At 2,000, and that seemed a big jump, but actually we are seeing fairly fast advancements in battery technology. It probably starts to make sense to have a battery at home, particularly if you can get signed up to demand side response solutions. So you might get paid a little bit of money to balance the grid and things like that. But it also then allows you to store more electricity during the day, and then you might want a bigger system, and then use it at night. And if you look at things like time of use tariffs, so Octopus have a tariff called the Agile tariff. If you can avoid 4 till 7, that tariff works out around about 8.5, 9p per kilowatt hour. Whereas ordinarily it might be 14 to 15p because of that peak period. Now, if you do use power in that peak period, I think they cap you out at 30p. So it's quite a big penalty. But if you had a solar PV system and battery storage, that could potentially make sense. Obviously, the other things when you think about solar PV are timing your washing machine to run at lunchtime. Your typical peak period will be 9 till 2. In the summer, it will be slightly longer. Dishwashers, all those kind of things. Only drink tea at lunchtime. There you go, because your kettle peaks at 3.5 kilowatts. So lots of things like that make sense, and you can really bump your numbers up on how much you're consuming by making the right decisions. If you work from home or you're retired and you live at home, clearly you're going to use a lot more electricity during the day as well. And it may be things like having, if you've got an immersion heater, for instance, you're heating, you can have something like Immersun, which will say, okay, we're using all the power, let's now take the rest of the power, put it into the Immersun, and let's heat some hot water for tonight. So there's lots of ways of optimizing and maximizing the use of solar PV on a roof. Next big technology is going to be heat pumps, and we have to decarbonize. We know that the grid will, not the grid, the government have turned around and said by 2025, no new developments can have a gas grid connection. So there is lots of talk. Hydrogen, my opinion, hydrogen is a million miles away, and by the time it gets there, it will be the dirty technology. So I think Wood Mackenzie came out with a report last month which said they thought that it could compete on price with gas by 2040. 20 years away. We can't wait 20 years, and yet this government is waiting 20 years, and the reason being the massive fossil fuel lobby. So when they wrote their white paper, they consulted with 144 fossil fuel companies and with 7 renewable energy companies. So the likes of Cadent and SGN. Cadent run all the big gas pipelines offshore into Britain, and then the main pipelines. Then SGN will run the smaller pipelines to your house, a little bit like National Grid and UKPN in terms of electricity. Those guys are I go to lots of events, and they're always there. And 5 years ago they said hydrogen will never work, it's too expensive, it's ludicrous. Now they're saying hydrogen is the greatest thing since sliced bread. It isn't. And the other problem with hydrogen is it takes quite a lot of energy to produce it. And where's that energy going to come from? We've already got all this heat that needs to be replaced with electricity. So it gets harder and harder. Typically, green hydrogen will produce around about 100 grams of 0.1 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. If you think about where we're heading with the grid, by say 2030, 2035, we might be at that level for electricity anyway. But heat pumps are super efficient. So then you've got to divide that number by 3 or 4. So by the time we get to 2040, my guess is heat pumps will be 4 to 5 times efficient. So they'll be like 20 grams, and hydrogen will be 100 grams. So I don't think hydrogen is going to be the solution. I think hydrogen might be a solution for big industrials, but I don't think it's going to be a solution for homes, because the economics won't be there. And by the time now, it will be too dirty. So heat pumps are where we're at. And there's 2 types of heat pumps. There are ground source heat pumps, and they're air source. And what ground source do is they drop boreholes in the ground, and they can be horizontal if you've got lots of land. Here in London, never going to be an option. So we would drop vertical boreholes. And then once you get down 100 meters or so, you get a fairly constant temperature of around about 12 degrees. And it uses that 12 degrees to bring up heat to the heat pumps to produce more heat. And I'll explain how that works in a minute. Whereas the air source, what that's doing is sucking in air from outside and using the heat. And I use heat, in a sort of fairly loose sense, because you're heating in winter, to to create that process. Now, in London, the average temperature in January, surprisingly, is 7 degrees, especially after the January we've just had, which is reasonably high. And it's a 6.5, I think it is. And then February and December 7. I think March is around about 9.5, and this is day-night temperatures average. And then April is like 13, and I think October is around about 13. So our temperatures are pretty high. So then, for a lot of the period of the heating season, it's not that different actually from the borehole solution. So how does a heat pump work? The heat pump works pretty much the same way as your fridge. So it's got refrigerants in it, and it's got compressors, and the compressors pump that refrigerant, and as you go through a change of state, that creates heat or it creates cooling depending on which side of the compressor you're on. So if you fill the back of your fridge, it'd be really, really hot. You may have, from the old days, pulled out your fridge and the grills, they're really, really toasty. That's essentially what the heat pump is doing. Now, the thing about heat pumps is they're getting better and better, but they are really aimed at relatively low heat temperatures. So these things will run about 50 degrees and 55 degrees for your hot water. So your heating will run at 50. Now, your old traditional boiler would have run at 70, 80 degrees, and it would have returned at sort of 60. Modern condensing boilers should be running around about 60-ish degrees and returning somewhere between 45 and 50. If they're not returning between 45 and 50, they're not condensing. So I don't think many people getting this 97, 98% efficiency because we're so used to running our heating at this very high number. What you should do, particularly if you've got a reasonably well insulated home, is turn your heating down, turn your boiler temperatures down, and run them longer and lower, and they will be much, much more efficient because then you get the condensing effect. Reality is none of us do that, and the boilers are probably working at sort of 75, 80% efficiency rather than up in the 90s. Heat pumps, because they're taking heat from the ground or from outside, and why I said sort of heat from outside loosely is actually even down at 0 or -2, that's still quite warm for refrigerants. Refrigerants change state at -40. So anything down to even, I think, -20, some of these new heat pumps work at, they'll still be producing heat. Now, once you dip below about -2, the efficiency starts to fall quite quickly. But living in London, how many days do we have really, really cold days, right? So that is a consideration. So that's how the technology works. Other considerations think about our size of the units. They're around about a meter by around about 400 mil. They make around about 60 decibels of noise. Within 2 meters away, they are around about 40, which is London background noise. So you're not really going to notice them at that point. You have to be a meter away from boundary walls. What else can I tell you? You can have smaller systems where you have a split system, so the refrigerant actually goes inside the house. They're more expensive to install. Then you just have a very small, pretty-looking fan that sits outside, sit in your garden or in your front garden. Much, much easier, but they probably cost a fair bit more. So that's sort of 16,000 at the top end is a very big one. That's probably a split system. Normal systems going into houses of the size in Southwest London, you're probably looking at £8,000 to £10,000 to install. You will get RHI though, and you get RHI until March next year. And what you get there is around about 10.5 pence per kilowatt hour of heat produced, minus the 1 kilowatt that's coming in to produce that heat. So heat pumps will be somewhere between 300% and 400% efficient depending on the technology. So for every 1 kilowatt of electricity you get 3 to 4 kilowatts of heat out. And yeah, that's pretty much it really on heat pumps. They save a huge amount of carbon because of that ratio. So that 0.22 I quoted for grams per kilowatt hour, you've got to divide that by 4. So you're ending up at say 0.55 or something, compared with gas being at 0.186. By the time you take the 85% efficiency of boilers, they're more like 0.22. So you're looking at a quarter of the emissions of a gas boiler. The other thing to consider when you're thinking about heat pumps as well is your gas boiler is pumping out gas flow emissions, which is NOx, particulate matter, carbon monoxide. And they don't count as greenhouse gas emissions, but they have a massive impact on air quality. And we're trying to get some value on that at the moment. We're doing some research at the moment on what is the social cost of our gas flue emissions. So essentially that's it. I'm here to answer some questions. I probably went on a little longer than I hoped, but I can stay as long as everyone has questions. So let me unshare my screen and see all your lovely faces.